Hello, everyone. The question I want to begin with today is, why do you do what you do? I think it's one of the most important questions that you'll ever encounter in life that makes an eternal difference for each of us, is to know and to increasingly understand, why do we do what we do? A few days ago, my youngest nephew, who knows about my position as a pastor, asked me, "Are you the boss?" I tried to explain how I was directly accountable to the leadership team, and that didn't seem to satisfy his young mind. So I simply said that some people might look at it that way, and that seemed to satisfy him, and off he went. But for me, the question of leadership and authority immediately brought to mind Jesus' position on authority and leadership that we find in Mark chapter 10, verses 42 to 45. The background of this story is that James and John had requested places or positions of honor in the kingdom. And later, the other 10 disciples find out about this, and they're very indignant. They're not happy about these other two disciples. They're not happy with them for the requests that they make. And so there's some displeasure, maybe some conflict, some comments. And so Jesus calls them together, and he deals with the matter, and this is what we read. Mark 10, verses 42 to 45. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So why were these other disciples so indignant? Did they understand their emotions, and what was that about? Was it simply that they too, if they were going to be honest, desired the same thing? Was there rivalry and competition between them in trying to gain Jesus' favor? And of course, Jesus calls them together, and he deals with the matter, and once again delivers a radical and a revolutionary teaching. Now, most of the people I know either grew up lower class or middle class. And we currently live in countries with a large middle class. And so I think it's more of our tendency to look at peoples as generally are equal, if you will. Not that we're the same, but that people would have equal access to things and sort of equal rights, and regardless maybe of their so-called heritage or financial situation, or probably other lists of things that we could think of that separate us, that we're different about. But as a result of us sort of growing up in this milieu or this culture of a large middle class that many of us either are part of or joined, we are removed from the experience of many in Jesus' day, where the culture was very class conscious. And it's not that power and position and privilege is not a thing today, because it certainly is, but it certainly was also in that day. Power and position and privilege were keenly sought after. A big deal, both for the Jews and the Romans. And though the slaves and the servants had protection under Jewish law, they weren't considered equals to their masters. And in this context of Jesus compares what the Gentiles were like, and he contrasts it really with what the kingdom is to be like. that their secular powers would lord it over them. But he says a real kingdom leader has a servant's heart. That the Gentile rulers dominated and oppressed and exploited those that they exercised authority over. And honestly, in our countries, over the last several years, we have seen more of this than I think that many of us in our lifetimes have ever seen from our ruling authorities. And Jesus says, right, that this is not the way of the kingdom. This is not God's way. This is not the way it is to be with Jesus' followers who are under God's rule. That God's way is that greatness equals servanthood. That whoever wants to be great, if you will, is to be a servant. And what does it mean to be a servant? Well, it voluntarily rendering useful services to others, to forfeit one's own rights, to serve, right? So it's not just about me, get. It's about how can I give? How can I help? It's not just about my interests. It's about your interests as well. It's not that I have to. I voluntarily, I sacrificially. That true greatness in the kingdom is not being a boss, not being the big boss. It's being a servant. And that's radical. That's controversial. And not only did Jesus teach this, he lived it. We read of examples where Jesus would come and they'd come to a house and he would wash people's dirty, grimy, probably smelly feet, when that was really the role of the servant or the slave. And Jesus, who was their leader, who was the God-man, would get down on his knees and wash their feet. That true greatness, right, was not in being served, but in serving others. And the climax, of course, in Jesus, that Mark talks about, right, the climax of Jesus' servanthood was that he voluntarily laid down his life for us. As he says, as a ransom for many. That we are captives under the power of sin and death, and that we cannot free ourselves. And Jesus' substitutionary death paid that price to set us free, right? Jesus took our place. He paid our penalty. He paid the cost so we could be set free. That Jesus provides this ultimate example of servanthood, literally laying down his life for us. Mark points out, right, that even Jesus, the God-man, didn't come to be served, but to serve. That we were created by God to serve one another. And what does servanthood look like? What does it mean to have a heart of a servant? In Philippians 2, 1-4, Paul talks about this. He talks about the heart of a servant. And of course, it's not just about what we're doing, it's also why are we doing, and what does that servant heart look like? And I draw these points right out of Eugene Peterson's paraphrase of this passage, that we are to agree, first of all, if we look at principles, number one is we need to be agreeing with each other instead of focusing on the minute details and differences. Let's find points of agreement with people, right? It's not my way or the highway. Servants don't have that attitude. They find ways to agree and work together. Secondly, we're to love one another, and the implications of that, we're to love one another. Thirdly, this act like we're on the same team, as opposed to conflict and clashing, working together for a common cause. Number 4, He puts it this way: don't push your way to the front of the line or sweet talk your way to the top. Right? Don't trample on people in your rush to succeed. Don't lie and sweet talk your way to the top. Number 5, be humble. What do we mean by that? Being humble doesn't mean that you degrade yourself. Or, on the other hand, certainly not being conceited. It's having an accurate picture of yourself. Being humble is having an accurate picture of yourself. And there's only so much we can see of ourselves. And that's why other people's input is helpful in developing a humble personality, developing humility. That we need to develop that accurate picture of ourselves. Do you know why you do what you do? Do you know how you impact others? Are you open to hearing that so that you can learn? Right? Are you okay with that you have flaws, that you make mistakes and people point them out? Can you embrace that and go, yeah, that sounds like me maybe. I'm working on that. I'm sorry. Right? Being humble, not denying these realities, but taking them as learning opportunities. Thank you for sharing that with me. That was hard to hear, but good for me to hear, right? Being humble. Number 6, don't be obsessed, right, with getting your own advantage and trampling on others, right? 7, be thinking of other people and their needs and their interests, right? He says it this way: forget yourself long enough to lend a helping hand, right? It's not just about me, servant heart. You're looking to be a blessing to other people. You're looking out for their concerns as well as your own, and you're trying to balance all of those things. That all authority that is given to us, as God says, is to be used for the good of those under our authority. And I want to add, under our influence. And let's consider some different relationships and what it looks like to have a servant heart. Right? That we're in it as a servant heart, not to get something from them and not to use them for something, but to give. And we give because we want to please God. And if we're not, we may do it for other reasons. Maybe we want to look good. We're nice people. That's our image. And we got all these other nauseating, in some ways, reasons why we may look good. And it all gets tested when someone doesn't respond well. See, when we do it for God, it's okay. We're okay if people don't respond well. Because we're doing it for God. We're doing it because that's the kind of people we want to be. People who do good and are concerned about others. And so I'm not going to give the answers, more some questions for us to think about. But what does it look like to be a servant in an intimate marital type of relationship? What does it look like to have a servant heart as a husband, as a wife? What does it look like to submit, to respect, to love? Ephesians 5:22-31 talks about this. Right? What does it look like for a man to love his wife with a servant heart? What does it look like for a woman to respect her husband with a servant heart? Parent and child relationships. Ephesians 6:1-4 talks about that. And what does that look like, right? It talks about how children are to obey their parents, but then how parents are to treat their children, right? In a way, you might say that the children want to obey, not to frustrate them. That parenting is this continuous job, and fathers are given the job to bring up their children in the training and the instruction of the Lord, right? That to meet their children's needs for love and tenderness and to nurture them, as well as to provide discipline as necessary. I saw a YouTube of a father. He was he was taking this video that he posted online. What we saw was this girl trudging along the side of a road with a backpack on. And he says she's walking to school. He proceeded to tell us that she had been, I think this was her second offense, but she had been kicked off the school bus because she'd been bullying another girl. And so her father said, well, you continue to go to school, but you're walking. He didn't give her a ride. He didn't make it easy. She had to walk. And he took the time out of his schedule just to drive slowly, of course, behind her to make sure she stayed safe. And he was there, but she walked because he wanted her to learn an important lesson. And of course, we could talk about employee relationships. In Ephesians 6, 4-9 talks about that, how the employer is to be obedient and respectful and sincere, to put their whole effort in, not just when the boss is looking, but to be always there, to serve wholeheartedly, if you will. And the employers were told to treat their employees as equals, right? Not looking down, but as equals. And government and citizen relationships, 1 Peter 2, 13-14 talks about that. Church and membership relationships, 1 Peter 5, 1-4 talk about that. I won't get into all that, but you can take some time to look at that, but just for time reasons, but recognizing, right, there's this call for those that are on one end that don't have the authority, right, to do good, to respond well, and those with the authority to treat people well, not arrogant, not using their position for dishonest gain, but to show mutual respect and honor. But in all of these cases, and whatever relationships we're talking about, those in power, those with position, these people are to use their position for the good, for the welfare of those under their authority. That this is the heart of servant leadership. To use their influence for good. Chuck Colson, in his book, A Dangerous Grace, wrote, "Nothing distinguishes the kingdom of man from the kingdom of God more than their diametrically opposed views of the exercise of power. One seeks to control people, the other to serve people. One promotes self, the other prostrates self. One seeks prestige and position, the other lifts up the lowly and despised." See, as citizens of heaven, the citizens of the kingdom, they were called to practice this view of power and set an example for the world around us as we model servanthood. And while the idea of servanthood isn't that difficult to understand, it is hard to do, right? To give up our race to the front of the pack and to help others. To change our focus from me as number one to caring about the well-being of others, even those that may not like me or may not treat me well. Even those people that are different and don't appreciate me for my efforts. Jesus, in closing, just to tell the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan, that Jesus tells us what it means to love our neighbor. What does it look like to love our neighbor, right? The Jewish man traveling in a remote road is ambushed by thieves who rob him and leave him for dead. Two religious leaders, one at a time, walk by and don't help. However, a Samaritan who has no cultural love for a Jew, they're different. In fact, they don't get along often as cultures. He's the one that stops and helps the man. And this, of course, Jesus says, who's the neighbor? This is Jesus' illustration for what it means to love our neighbors. It gives us an idea of what a servant heart looks like, what a sounds like, beats like, if you will, what servant behavior looks like. So why do you do what you do? Is it to be simply liked, respected, because you see yourself as a nice person? You don't want to look bad? Or is it to serve God? That you approach life, people, with a servant heart because you love God and you love others, and you recognize that that's your calling in the places that you, especially in the places that you have authority and influence, to be a servant and to serve others. In closing, as I reflected on this, I realized I guess I should have just been told my nephew, no, I'm not the boss. I'm a servant.